But I'm here to really talk to you about leveraging tourism and travel as a mechanism to fund climate action. So the sort of high level point I want to leave you with today is that tourism is not going anywhere. People will continue to travel in the future. And so as we talked about yesterday, negotiating the release of this lifestyle that we've all come to appreciate, I don't think that we want to live a life where no one gets to travel, no one gets to see the world. So the question is, how do we turn tourism from a net drain on our natural and social systems into something that can be part of regenerating and sustaining those systems over time? So I want to start with a sort of high-level framing of the problem of the climate crisis, so we're all clear on the scale of what we are dealing with here. This is a sort of a diagram from a McKinsey report a few years ago, just showing the fact that emissions are not really changing very much. They are very high and not going down very quickly. And if we're going to achieve target goals set out by, say, the UN IPCC, we need to both dramatically reduce emissions. That's the top bars, the blue lines need to go down dramatically. And we're also going to need some level of what are called negative emissions, also known as carbon dioxide removals. And the reason for this is twofold. One, we've already released trillions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and those aren't just going to go away. They will continue to have a warming effect for decades and centuries to come. And two, we're not going to get emissions to zero. We can reduce them, but ultimately we all need to live our lives, we all need to eat, and we all want to travel. So it's unreasonable to expect emissions to go completely to zero. And negative emissions provide a mechanism for accounting for the negative impact of those activities, even after we've reduced the impact as much as we can. So carbon markets are one mechanism that have been developed decades ago to address this notion of how do we incentivize the right behavior. Let's just say they're somewhat controversial technology. There have been a lot of problems historically, but my goal here in the presentation today is to hopefully separate the notion of the fundamental financial technology of a carbon credit from the traditional use case of one-to-one offsetting that carbon credits have historically been used to carry out. So you might be thinking in your head, well, wait, are carbon credits just for greenwashing? I thought carbon credits were bad. And the reality is a little more nuanced. In particular, the UN IPCC has been very clear that there is no path to staying below 2 degrees C that doesn't involve large-scale carbon dioxide removals. And the only mechanism we have right now for funding large-scale carbon dioxide removals are things like carbon credits and similar markets. So you can imagine the government coming in and saying, hey, we're going to deploy, $1 trillion of capital and pay people to directly remove carbon from the atmosphere. Let's just say I don't see that being a terribly pragmatic political case, at least here in the US. I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon. And so in the absence of large-scale government action, market-based solutions provide a clear mechanism for funding this important work of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It doesn't require top-down political coordination. So let's get a little bit into what the different types of carbon credit projects are. And the two big distinctions are between what are called removals and avoidances. So a removal means you're going to draw down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that was already emitted, whereas an avoidance is you're going to reduce the emissions that are ongoing from activities such as generating electricity or preventing deforestation. So you probably see a lot of your sort of favorite carbon credit types up here. You've got afforestation, that's planting trees. You've got renewable energy installation like windmills and solar farms. You've got forest conservation. You also have some more sort of controversial and technology-based things like carbon capture and storage, where you put up a scrubber on a coal plant and capture the carbon dioxide that would have been emitted, as well as things like direct air capture, which are kind of like sci-fi technology that's being deployed at relatively small scales right now to literally suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it underground or in some other form of permanent storage. So the point here is there's many different methodologies that can be used to achieve the net end of either avoiding or removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And they break down into these two big buckets. So you might be thinking, well, what's better? Is avoidance better or removal better? And the point I'd like to make is that it's more of a transition question, because right now, the only technologies and methodologies we have for large-scale carbon credit generation are avoidance-based. For instance, installing renewable energy or protecting existing forests from being cut down. The removal technology is still pretty new and isn't being deployed at large scale. So the idea is that at the moment, the most effective way to spend our money is to avoid emitting in the first place. But over time, the amount of avoidances that we can do are going to go down because we've already installed solar panels, we've already protected existing forests, whereas removals are theoretically unlimited. There's the only theoretical cap would be like the total amount of carbon dioxide on the planet, and that's obviously way beyond what we're capable of today. So the idea is that avoidances will cap out over the next 5 to 10 years, removals will scale up over the next 5 to 10 years, and in the steady state, removals are balancing ongoing emissions. So in order to avoid catastrophic climate change, The scale of this market needs to grow by approximately 15 times, according to a report from the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market. And this is basically looking at, okay, well, what's the expected emissions reductions from existing government plans versus the amount of removals we can expect, all else being equal. And sort of to get those two numbers to be equal to each other, we're looking at about a 15 times scale up by 2030. That's pretty dramatic. Most industries have not scaled by 15 times in 10 years. So the question is, what are the enabling technologies that will allow for that scale? Before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about how the voluntary carbon market actually works. I'm going to end up using a lot of terminology that might be sort of confusing if I don't go over this. So this is a simplified diagram of the structure of the voluntary carbon market. And so we have a given methodology that's going to be used. Say you're going to go plant trees. And on the top part of this diagram, we have the supply side of the market. This is where the credit is going to be generated. So we have a project developer at the top right. That's a local community group on the ground who's got to go and plant the trees, right? They're going to go actually do the action. They're going to use a standardized methodology from a standard like Verra or Gold Standard that has been scientifically developed and reviewed with a set of data points that are going to have to be measured to assess whether or not that project actually did what they said they were going to do. Things like how many trees survived to maturity, what was the size of the average circumference of the trees at maturity. And there's a third party, a verifier called a VVB, Validation and Verification Body, and they're basically the auditor. They're going to come in and make sure that the project actually did everything the right way, collect the data points, and then report that back to the registry prior to issuing the carbon credits themselves. Once that verification is complete, the registry like Verra or Gold Standard, they go ahead and they issue the credits to the project developer. And now the project developer can go and sell those credits on the market to make their money and then turn that money around into more project development activities. So now you have a verified credit, the green diamond, and it transitions from the supply side where it's generated over to the demand side where it's going to be used. And there's a whole set of financial intermediaries on the demand side that now in the traditional market effectively gatekeep access, end up absorbing a lot of the value they're flowing through the system. So that bottom right-hand corner is like where I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the efforts that ClaimItDAO is making to disrupt that traditional set of financial intermediaries. But the point is you've got an end user who wants to get at the carbon credit, right? Who wants to use their money to support these projects on the ground. And they go through this process called retirement, which is like the technical term for destroying the carbon credit and claiming that benefit for yourself or your organization. You can imagine when you go into the store and you buy an apple, that apple has some amount of use value and that you can eat it and like get calories and enjoy the taste of the apple. Once you eat the apple though, that value is gone. No one is going to buy the apple core off of you, even though before you ate it, they might have bought the apple itself for its use value. Similarly, when you buy a carbon credit from a broker, it's still live, right? It's an uneaten apple. You could, in theory, go and sell it again if somebody else wanted it and was willing to pay for it. But once you retire it, i.e. you destroy the credit, claim it, and say, I was the one who claimed this credit, no one else can use that credit again to make the same claim. And maintaining that integrity is really important because obviously if you can make two claims on the same credit, that phenomenon is known as double counting. And it's one of the phenomena that we're trying to really avoid with the digital technology that I'm about to go into. Okay, so that's the overall structure of the carbon market. You have end users who want to fund climate action. You've got project developers who want to go implement climate action. And carbon credits are just a mechanism for channeling that capital in a verifiable and reliable way. Okay, so here's the opportunity. We know we need to scale up this market if it's going to have a substantial impact on the climate crisis. And there are some limiting factors in that structure diagram that I walked through, specifically around financial intermediaries and the risk of double counting. So the World Bank identified that blockchain technologies in particular offer the promise of addressing the needs of these next generation climate markets, especially given the need to scale them up dramatically. So let me talk about some of the benefits that the digital carbon market, as we call it, offers over the traditional carbon market. So typically, if you wanted to go and get your hands on carbon credits, let's say you're a corporation or say you run an accommodation in a location and you want to make sure that your accommodations are climate positive. Maybe you're an airline and you want to offer an option to the people flying on your airline to address the environmental impact associated with their travel. Normally, in the traditional market, you would need to go call a broker literally on the phone. You're going to go back and forth with them over email, and then they're going to give you a quote. You'll send them a wire transfer, and then they will email you a PDF document. That is basically what happens. I'll show you an example of the PDF document in a moment. And the fees and timelines associated with that are obviously quite excessive. It's very much a 1980s, 1990s style of running the business. Whereas what we offer powered by blockchain technology in this new digital carbon market is the same asset, but available nearly instant settlement times, a few percentage point fees instead of like 30 to 50% fees, as well as a much easier way to access them. So you don't have to like call somebody on the phone. And if you're buying a small amount, they won't take you seriously. You can just go online and use a sort of standard web interface to get access to these assets. The other thing I want to emphasize is around that double counting point. So when you're buying through a traditional broker, calling over the phone, getting a PDF, it's very difficult for you to prove in a verifiable way what you actually did. You could show people the PDF. Yeah, sure. Okay, they can go look up the serial number, but it's not like a user-friendly web interface where they can see a breakdown of like what types of carbon projects you supported and when was the last time you retired carbon credits and things like this. So we think the transparency that's offered by this digital technology is really important given the trust-based nature of this whole setup, right? We need to trust that the projects actually did what they said they were going to do, and we need to trust that the people using the credits to make claims are making those claims in a reasonable and responsible way. So this is a little diagram that gives you a gist of how the digital carbon market actually works. I'll speak through it a bit. On the left-hand side, we have the carbon projects. That's the examples I was talking about before, like going and planting trees. And then you have the verified carbon standards, which are the Verra and gold standard, as on the other diagram. Now, in the traditional system, when those credits are issued, they get traded around among a bunch of intermediaries and then bought by somebody over the phone. Whereas in the digital carbon market, we're taking that asset and creating a digital representation of that asset so that it can be moved around and traded in a much more transparent and efficient way than calling people over the phone. And then finally, we create what's called a liquidity pool, which is basically where we combine a bunch of different individual carbon credits into a single asset that can be traded at a given price. And the reason for this is that there's a fundamental trade-off between liquidity and fungibility. Fancy technical terms, but liquidity is this notion that if I want to get my hands on an asset, I can do so quickly and at a reasonable price slippage, i.e. if I want to buy a lot, it's not that much more expensive than if I wanted to buy a little. Fungibility is the notion that two given assets should be identical or are identical. So for instance, if I have $2 bills, those dollar bills are exactly identical in every way, in the sense that if I go to a bodega and I try to buy something with $1 versus the other, the bodega doesn't care about the difference between them. Whereas with carbon credits, they're heterogeneous by nature because two different projects that are both doing afforestation, one might be in Southeast Asia, the other might be in Latin America, may have different attributes, one may be different years, they may have been implemented at different times. And so naturally, there will be a difference in value between those different assets. So a liquidity pool is just a way of striking a balance between the uniqueness of an individual carbon credit and the fact that buyers really don't want to have to deal with individual projects. They want to say, like, I want to support afforestation projects. And regardless of whether that project is in Africa or South America, I should be able to know or have a fixed price, a known price for what that type of carbon credit is worth. And then finally, we have a retirement aggregator, which is just a tool to make it really easy for users to retire different types of carbon credits without having to worry about going to 5 different websites and understanding different systems. I want to speak a little more to this question of liquidity pools and pricing. So there's a variety of different classes of credits. As I was talking about before, we have everything from installing renewable energy to planting trees, and those different methodologies command different prices in the market. So the way we've been thinking about this is in terms of a stratified market, where you have a base, a floor price, and then different types of credits will trade at different premiums above that floor. Now, what that premium should be and like how those prices are determined is a market question, right? The buyers and the sellers have different preferences about what types of credits they think are valuable or should be used, and what that will be expressed in relative prices. So we've created these different liquidity pools. Right now, there are 2 tiers to the market on chain. In this digital carbon market, there's a broad-based floor and there's a nature-based avoidance. Broad-based floor includes things like installing renewable energy, converting industrial processes to reduce fugitive emissions, and other technology-based avoidance. Whereas nature-based avoidance is typically trades at a premium to technology-based avoidance. These include projects that will protect existing forests or improve the management of a forest so that deforestation is reduced or the ecosystem does not become degraded. Conversely, you'd have things like nature-based removals, which would be higher up the value tiers. They are more expensive to produce and they have a different price, therefore. Okay, so we've recently built a interface that makes it relatively easy for users to navigate this complex market where you can see individual projects, compare their prices, compare their benefits, and make a choice about what type of credits you want to support. And the idea here is that just like when you go into the grocery store and you buy a head of lettuce, you're basically sending an indirect price signal to the lettuce farmers to go farm more lettuce, right? And if everybody stopped buying lettuce, there would be no more farmers producing lettuce because it wouldn't be profitable for those farmers to do so. Similarly, when a user goes and buys and retires a given carbon credit, they're sending a signal to the market, say, I want more of this type of project to be carried out. So just showing you sort of the technology that this enables. Now, the converse here, if you were to compare this with like a traditional sourcing process, you would like call somebody on the phone, they send you a spreadsheet or maybe like an email with 3 or 4 different project options, and then you go back and forth with them negotiating prices. Whereas this experience I'm showing you here on Carbon Mark is more like when you go on Amazon and you see a bunch of different products and maybe even the same product available for different prices. And then you as the user can comparison shop and see all the information without having to be gate kept. Imagine if you wanted to order, say, a notebook on Amazon, and to do that, you had to call a broker and like ask what types of notebooks they had available. I don't think any of us would be very happy with that user experience. So we're trying to improve on that user experience for the buyer and also allow the sellers more direct access to the market so that instead of having to go and sell your credits to a broker who will then take a 30% markup when they sell it on to a corporation for their sustainability goals, instead the project developer can directly list their project on Carbon Mark, and every dollar that they take in is dollar that went to the project developer and not to a financial intermediary. I've laid out the basics of the carbon market. Hopefully I didn't overwhelm you with the amount of information. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me toward the end. But I want to get into some more of the use cases, like how are these credits used? And how does the fact that we are digitizing this market allow for more transparent and efficient monitoring and reporting? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what traditional corporate responsibility pledges look like and how they use carbon credits. So yesterday, we had a presentation from a consulting group that helps organizations put together corporate sustainability and responsibility reports like this one we're about to look at. This is from a group called Sanmar. They're a textile company. So this is an example. I went on their corporate responsibility page. I looked up their most recent corporate responsibility update, which was 2021. And then buried down in there, I found that there was a little blurb, and it said that they have supported a carbon offset project, wind power project in India. Now, there's no other information. No project IDs, no links to a certificate, nothing. Just this little blurb on page 6 of 7 of their corporate responsibility report. Okay. And then I went and I digged around and I found the certificate. So this is what the PDF that they got from the broker that says, Sanmar, blah, 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 wind energy project, name of project in India, right? And then the serial number. Now that serial number is really important. So like they did 1,500 tons, right? This is the name of the organization. The broker they used was obviously carbonfund.org, the project they supported, and then the serial number. So that serial number is what you could go look up and be like, oh, I'm going to make sure that they actually did things the right way. So you go on this website and you type in the numbers, okay? And I hope I'm demonstrating how ridiculous it is to actually figure out what this company did to meet the pledge they said they made in their corporate responsibility report, when there's now technology available to make this much easier for me as like an end user of Sanmar products to go and see, did they actually do what they said they were doing? So I'll show you now the alternative that we're building out, and that is what we call our pledge app. And the idea here is that on one side of the page, you see the pledge. This is the why the company is doing this, their estimated footprint, and the methodology they used to arrive at that estimate. And then on the other side, you see the specific actions they've taken, in particular, the carbon credit types that they've retired. This is still very much like a first version of this, but the goal is to show side by side the commitment and the action so that you don't have to go digging around in a bunch of different PDFs and Googling stuff to figure out if they did what they said they were going to do. Pledges are connected through this little drop-down menu with the individual retirement activities, so you can see like the certificate. If you really want a PDF, we can generate the PDF, and this has all the same information that you would expect to see on a Vera certificate, for instance. So this is connected with a big campaign that we ran called the Love Letters campaign, where we were sharing around these retirement notices, because unlike a PDF, which is sort of inherently unshareable, these are transactions on a public blockchain. So everything is shareable in a sort of native internet format. So we were creating these little cards that can embed as a tweet to promote the activity that you've taken. And also we have a website called loveletter.cleanadao.finance, where we've got like a gallery of all these different retirement messages. So it's a little bit about reporting and sort of the vision that we have for a better version of corporate sustainability reporting and how the digital technology enables that. Finally, I want to cover some novel use cases that this technology unlocks. Before I get into that, I want to emphasize this structural imbalance. So I mentioned that the way carbon credits are sourced historically is by calling people on the phone. And when you have this broker setup, you end up in a situation where buyers come around infrequently. And when they come around, they buy sort of all at once. So a corporation might show up once a year, buy a big batch, and then go away because they've done their purchasing for that year. And this creates a really imbalanced market where you have people constantly looking to sell, and the buyers are very few and far between. And so it becomes very cutthroat. No one wants to share their supply numbers. Nobody wants to tell anybody what the prices they're paying are. It becomes a situation where the sellers are all very defensive and the buyers are all very aggressive because they know that they have a lot of power. And one of the ways that we can address this imbalance is by having more consistent demand that doesn't just show up once a year and then go away, but rather demand that is recurring throughout the year, even if it's relatively small amounts. Just having some transactions validates things like price, right? Like if somebody's buying a small amount at a given price, you at least know that someone's willing to pay that price. Whereas if it's all huge purchases behind closed doors, nobody really knows what a fair price might be. So to that end, we built some integrations. One example is with an application called Sushi Swap. It's a decentralized exchange. You don't need to know anything about what any of that means. It's a financial application. People swap one asset for another, and we worked with them to build a small additional fee in that will basically retire a small amount of carbon credits every time somebody makes a swap. Just a small example of the kind of stuff that's possible. Now, something like this, if say, the New York Stock Exchange wanted to implement this, right, using traditional analog off-chain carbon credits, once a month, they're going to have to call a broker or once a quarter or whatever and fulfill all the orders. And it's not going to be automated or transparent. It's going to be basically a big back office operation. Whereas the fact that we've digitized these assets enables us to build these kinds of automatic integrations. Similarly, we've got lots of in-person events, conferences, seminars like this, where people come together from all over the world. And there is carbon emissions associated with those events. And I don't think we're going to stop having in-person events. I don't think we're going to stop organizing conferences. And so there's a sense in which a lot of these emissions are unavoidable. We can talk about taking, trains instead of planes. We can talk about, taking ocean liners across the Atlantic, sure. But the reality is that most people traveling are not willing to make that trade-off. And there's a lot of work to be done by the travel sector to improve the options that are available for people when they're making a decision about how to travel. And so filling the calendar with recurring event retirements where, events are estimating the emissions associated with their organization, with their event, and then consuming carbon credits to support projects that are planting trees or installing renewable energy, you have much more consistent demand because events occur all throughout the calendar year. Finally, we're working with a group called Provide to build an SAP integration where, for instance, shipping companies and logistics providers would be estimating the emissions associated with their operations in near real time. And every time, say, a truck leaves the docking bay, they're consuming carbon credits corresponding to those emissions. And finally, most relevant to the travel sector and leading into my use case is this notion of online travel booking. So if you've booked an airline flight recently, you've probably been offered to consume carbon credits or other sustainability options during checkout. Let's just say we have some ideas about how to improve that process. The same idea could in theory be applied to things like rental cars and hotel bookings, although I'd say those markets are much less mature than the flight booking use case, mostly because there's this organization called ICAO, the International Committee on Aviation or something like that, and they have a really good estimate for per mile emissions of flights. So when you have good estimates, it's much easier to build these kinds of integrations because you don't have these huge error bars that you have to convince people it's okay to retire based on those, even though the error bars are huge. So I wanted to go into the aviation use case a little bit deeper because I think it's a really good demonstration of the unique advantages that digital technology offers to carbon markets. So I'm going to talk about opt-in offsetting, one-to-one, right, compensation of emissions from flying. As I was saying before, I think one of the big opportunities here is to push beyond one-to-one offsetting into like offering the user an option like, hey, do you want to do one-to-one or do you want to do 1.5 or 2? And that way the user has more choices. That being said, there is also an organization called CORSIA that is an international agreement among 100 and some odd states have already agreed to it that is slowly phasing in mandatory carbon credit consumption for airlines. And basically right now it's a voluntary program where airlines and individual nation states can opt in to have some amount of their aviation emissions compensated for using carbon credits. In the second phase, starting in 2027, this will become mandatory. So any states that are participating, their airlines will be required to consume carbon credits in line with the CORSIA standards. I am not talking about CORSIA. It's a whole other can of worms. I'm by no means expert in it. I'm just talking about voluntary opt-in carbon credit retirement of the form we see, for instance, on Air Canada. So I was checking out on a flight, I think this was to Vancouver, and it was like 500 kilograms of CO2 is my estimated greenhouse gas emissions from this flight, my share, right? Not the whole flight, just my share. And it quoted me $12.92. And if I click the little box, they will add that cost to my checkout. And you might think, oh, well, I click the box and then they go retire the carbon. Not exactly. What's really going on is they're using a provider called Choose. Every month or every quarter, they call brokers, right? They source the carbon credits and they bundle them all together and then they issue a retirement in Vera or in Gold Standard. And you don't really get much proof that like you contributed. You get like an email from them saying that you did this, but you don't have a certificate even. You don't really have any evidence that Choose did what they said they were going to do and retired the carbon credits on your behalf. And the reason for this, it's not anything wrong with Choose. It's just that they're operating in the traditional market where the only way to interact with this asset is by like calling people on the phone and clicking buttons on a website. So there's just to go into some of the details. When you do the estimated price per ton here, we're talking $24.54. There's also a 42-cent per flight leg per passenger fee, just a flat fee that they add in. You have to look in the fine text to find that out. And then in terms of which projects Choose is offering, I looked on their website and it turns out it's a mix of 5 different projects that they've curated, but the proportions are unclear. It wasn't clear from their website. The fulfillment process is totally manual, right? They're on the back end, they're going and calling people on the phone. And then the shareability is totally non-existent. There's no way for me to prove to anybody else that I actually did this, except for like, I guess, send around a screenshot of the receipt. So we're trying to build an alternative here. We're working specifically with a chartered jet company to build out this prototype, but the underlying technology could be applied to Choose, for instance. But I'm going to talk about the context of Fly Air, which is this chartered jet company that we're working with. They basically have a mobile app. You can see an illustrative screenshot of that on the right-hand side. In the mobile app, it's going to be telling you, here's how many carbon credits you've consumed. And we're going to have like a certificate page where you can see the individual retirement events and share those out. All the information is available on the back end under the hood. It's just a matter of surfacing that. Whereas with something like Choose, the data isn't there to surface. So just to compare the details we looked at with Choose, the price per ton is very flexible here because we can offer a variety of different projects that have a very wide range in prices, everywhere from $1 a ton up to $33 a ton. There's definitely a role for someone like Choose to be curating what projects a given airline might want to support. But the key is like right now, they're curating in a way that they're capturing a massive markup. And we would prefer if they were sourcing directly from projects, and rather than capturing a huge markup, they captured a reasonable, transparent fee. So in terms of the provider fee on our system, we're looking at a 1% to 3% of the purchase amount. So it's not a fixed fee, it's all proportional to the amount of carbon credits purchased. Credit selection is quite wide, and we're not curating for the user. We give the user that choice about what type of projects to support. The fulfillment process is totally automated. This is where we get into some of the blockchain stuff, but like you can issue a transaction from your smart wallet and in seconds have the retirement confirmed. If you've never interacted with blockchain or Web3, we've also built out some nice user-friendly interfaces for doing this, where you sign up with an email address, you put in your credit card. It's all very familiar, just a little less Web3, a little less blockchain, but much more user-friendly. And finally, regardless of whether you pay using a Web3 wallet or using a credit card, you get a shareable link to your unique retirement page, which you can then share on social media or whatever to promote the fact that you are taking this step and putting your money where your mouth is. Just to compare at a high level, very expensive, no flexibility. You've got some flexibility at a range of prices. Single-digit % of the purchase amount as opposed to a fixed fee. You get a wide selection instead of forcing the user in, and automated versus manual and shareable versus not shareable. But I think the advantages are pretty clear that digital technology offers, and we just see this as the next evolution of carbon markets and hopefully address some of the issues that have historically created a lot of controversy around this asset class. So just some key takeaways. Mitigating the climate crisis is going to require both reductions and removals. There's really no way around that. Carbon credits are an important mechanism for funding avoidance and removals, and are not necessarily the same as a one-to-one offsetting strategy. That is a way of using carbon credits. It's not the only way to use them. Legacy carbon markets are opaque, and using digital technology, we can disintermediate the financial intermediaries and gatekeepers who have traditionally captured most of the value flowing through that system. Digital technology brings that unprecedented access, allows anybody, you and I as individuals, small organizations who are historically cut out of the carbon market to get access to this new asset class. And programmability unlocks these new use cases, as well as automating some manual fulfillment processes for things like airline offsetting. Finally, this is a little more out there, but we see this digitization of the carbon markets as a playbook for future ecological benefit assets that have nothing to do with carbon. For instance, there's a lot of interest right now in biodiversity credits, where you'd be paying people to protect biodiversity or restore degraded biodiverse landscapes. Similarly, with things like plastic removal credits, water quality credits, there's a lot of excitement about these new credit classes. Not a lot of concrete playbooks for like, what does it look like to build a new market and how do you generate demand? Well, that's it.